Everybody, Thersites the historian here, and I would like to talk about Justinian II Rhinotmetus, an emperor of Byzantium who ruled from 685 to 695, and again from 705 to 715. He is a controversial figure, mainly because he was once disfigured in a way which made him ineligible to serve as emperor by the standards of his day, and yet he strove to come back, and he successfully did rule once again for another 10 years. Now, there's a lot of mythology surrounding Justinian II, and I would like to talk about some of that, and also look at his time in a more general sense to kind of contextualize him and his life. So without too much further ado, let's dig right in. One of the reasons why I wanted to do a project on Justinian II is because I was really interested in busting some of the myths and misconceptions that someone who has only read about him online would most likely have, given the absolute poverty of thought that goes into typical treatments of Justinian. Here's one from Badasses of History. I'll read you the opening paragraph of their take on Justinian. Emperor Justinian II of Byzantium wasn't a brilliant military strategist, a capable ruler, a benevolent dictator, or even a fucking half-decent human being. He was a ruthless, merciless motherfucker who crushed all who opposed him, brutally eliminated his enemies, and let nothing stand in the way of his insane, over-the-top, possibly misguided mission to stomp the lower intestines of anybody ballsy enough to think they could screw him over for any reason. His entire existence was dedicated to one incredibly badass mission: live for revenge. Well, that sounds great, but unfortunately it's mostly bullshit. Sure, Justinian was a ruthless guy. However, he lived in the 7th and 8th centuries, when pretty much everyone fit that description. This is not unusual for a man of his time period. So if we're going to say something like what they're saying here, we'd have to assume that what Justinian did was in some way atypical or bizarre, and that is simply not the case. There are other sources which pretend to be more serious and more high-minded than Badasses of History, which at least can be forgiven since it's clearly just for entertainment, such as the YouTube channel The Real Crusades History, or whatever they call themselves, who accept the notion that Justinian was a deranged madman, and they are only really interested in glorifying the Catholic Church and really trying to cast aspersions against Islam in the Middle Ages. But that's neither here nor there. I'm sure at some point in the future we'll have recourse into, refute some of their stuff directly. But anyway, until then, let's just move on and talk about Justinian II and the myths surrounding his reign. Before we really dig into Justinian's life, I think it's important to take a moment to sort of talk about the sources that we're actually using in order to learn about Justinian and his times. The two major sources on Justinian are Nicephorus the Patriarch and Theophanes, who wrote a work called the Chronicle. Now, both of these works were written anywhere from about half a century to a full century after Justinian's time, and both of them paint a pretty negative portrayal of Justinian, especially Theophanes. There also are more contemporary Italian and Arab sources which mention his activities as emperor as it pertained to their own affairs. The main scholar whose work I'm following in this video is Constance Head, who wrote the book Justinian II of Byzantium in 1972, and in that book she was basically writing a revisionist account of Justinian and his life, where she makes the claim that this negative tradition that we see in Nicephorus and Theophanes, but not in the foreign sources and not, say, in the church records, because at one point Justinian II was celebrated as a saint with a feast day. That didn't last forever. It was discontinued because of his negative historiographical reputation. Anyway, she makes what I find to be a compelling argument about the sources, and I also think that she does a very good job of proving that Justinian II was not a madman, even if he fell short of being, Plato's ideal philosopher prince. So those are sort of the things I'm drawing on and the argument that I'm going to be advancing in this video. Justinian II was born into the Heraclean dynasty, and he was destined to become the first fifth-generation ruler in Roman history. Now, I say Roman because the Byzantines self-identified as Roman, and even though they spoke Greek by Justinian's time, the 7th and 8th centuries, they referred to themselves as the Romans. So they called themselves the Hoi Romanoi, if you want to hear the Greek. His father was named Constantine IV, and his coin is pictured on your screen. Constantine IV was an avid admirer of the 6th century emperor Justinian I, and because of that, he named his eldest child Justinian after that famous ruler. Justinian I, of course, is the ruler who built the Hagia Sophia and also reestablished Byzantine control of North Africa and Italy. Now, Justinian as a child had a younger brother named Heraclius. However, so far as we can tell, Heraclius must have died in childhood, which was a fairly common thing in antiquity and the Middle Ages. He had two uncles who were very close in age to him, and that he would have grown up with them. They were only a few years older, but when he was about 12 in the year 681, his father Constantine IV decided to have the two uncles mutilated and had them exiled. Now, we'll talk about the method of mutilation chosen, since it is one which Justinian II himself would later experience. Now, Constantine IV died at the age of 33 in the year 685 when Justinian II was only 16. And that might sound worse than it actually is, but in this world you were considered a full-grown and fully competent man at the age of 15. So Justinian II was fully qualified, and with his younger brother dead and his uncles removed from the succession and considered to be ineligible for office due to their physical imperfections, Justinian had a clear path to power, and as we'll see, he was actually quite obviously fit for that power. The most important event of Justinian's youth and the crowning achievement of his father Constantine IV was the repulsion of the Arab invasion and siege of Constantinople. The siege lasted for 5 years and was ultimately repulsed by the invention of Greek fire, which helped to destroy the Arab fleet and enabled Constantinople to hold out. Any proper understanding of Justinian II has to take into account the state of the Byzantine Empire in the year 685 when he came to power. So let's look at the world around him and what was going on. So from 632 onward, the Arabs had been invading Byzantine territory, and that had been a struggle that all the Heraclean emperors had faced. Heraclius I was still in power when the initial Arab invasions happened, and he grew old and sickly trying to fight the Arab invasions in his last years. Constantine IV, as we've already discussed, the fourth generation Heraclean ruler, repulsed a direct attack on Constantinople. During this time, as you can see on the map, North Africa had not completely fallen to the Arabs yet, and that wouldn't happen until during the time of Justinian, actually. Now, one thing that's not quite as clear on this map is that there are Bulgars all across the Balkans. Bulgars, of course, being the ancestors of the present-day Bulgarians. They were politically divided in ways that are somewhat confusing. There are the Bulgars north of the Danube who are depicted on the map. There are also the Avars around. And then there were Bulgars and these people called Sclavenians in the Balkans at the same time. It's not really clear how much of the Balkans the Byzantines directly controlled, at any given time during the 7th and 8th centuries, but it is sufficient to note that imperial control was far from 100%, and we can suspect that it was pretty hard to recruit men or raise taxes in that area. Because of the actions of Justinian I in the 6th century, the Byzantines still held significant territory in Sicily and Italy. And in fact, Justinian II's grandfather had actually tried to relocate the capital of the empire to Syracuse. However, when he died and Constantine IV took power, Constantine decided to remain in Constantinople since that was clearly the power center of the empire. There also is the theme system, where military districts are set up and you have a governor in charge of both the civil and military administration, and they command the local province in order to raise armies to defend it. That is a system set up by the Heracleans and which would last for centuries more. There's some debate as to whether or not Justinian improved upon the system. It looks like he may have, but the evidence is a bit ambiguous on that count. By this point, though, two of the most important parts of the old Byzantine Empire were lost, namely Syria and Egypt, which some people think may have accounted for somewhere in the neighborhood of 2/3 or 3/4 of the wealth of the empire in the time of someone like Justinian I. Now, the most important battleground and frontier is in Asia Minor. That's where the Byzantines encountered the Umayyad Caliphate, and it's also, as you can see on the map, their heartland at this point. This is where the majority of the recruits for their army are coming from, and this is the vital area, not, for reasons we've already discussed, the Balkans, or Greece itself. In the interest of clarity, I would like to look at his two reigns separately and also divide the aspects of each reign into thematic categories to keep things as clear as humanly possible. So I would first like to look at politics and war making during Justinian's first reign, which ran from 685 to 695 CE. The first major war that Justinian orchestrated was an all-across-the-board offensive in 688-689, which saw Byzantine armies on the attack in Armenia, Syria, and North Africa. This was an overwhelming success, and it resulted not only in territorial gains, but in the Caliph sending tribute to Constantinople. And it was a fairly heavy tribute. He also then launched a successful campaign in the Balkans against the Sclavenians, and despite what Theophanes says, he clearly won the war. We can see that not only because he's able to settle a lot of Sclavenians in Asia Minor, forcing them to leave the Balkans where they're causing problems, and settling them where they can be a military colony, but we also see that he made a lot of war booty and took a lot of captives in the war, so it's pretty clear that he won. He also, because of his successes, was greatly honored by the city of Thessalonica, and we found some inscriptions and other evidence which shows that he was extremely popular there, even if he didn't really have a great legacy elsewhere. But of course, Constantinople was the capital, and public opinion there is what went into the sources, not in a provincial city like Thessalonica. He also, when he signed a treaty with the Arabs, agreed to relocate a people called the Mardites to the Balkans, and the sources, they claim that he moved the entire people and that left the frontier defenseless against the Arabs. However, that's not true. We find references in the sources to the Mardites still harassing the Arabs. At least we find that in Arab sources, and we still find it about a century later, so clearly Justinian did not move all of the Mardites. Now, why was he moving so many people around his empire? Well, it's actually an age-old trick. This is something that many rulers across time have done. If you remember Nebuchadnezzar and the Jewish exile, the reason is he wanted to divide a people group to prevent them from having enough unity to revolt. If you take Sclavenians out of the Balkans and settle them in the east, then they're going to be more loyal to their paymaster than to someone else, and then they will serve loyally in your military. At least that's the hope. It ended up not working out that well, as we'll see. Now, we're not really clear what caused the treaty between Justinian and the Caliph to break down, but in the sources, which again are hostile and portray Justinian as a foaming at the mouth crazy person, they say that it was because he was angry at them for minting their own coins for the first time, and that he was really angered that they were putting Islamic art on the papyrus that they were exporting out of Egypt. Now, it does look like they were using these things as provocations, and these sound like pretty stupid pretexts to us, but people in this period took religion very seriously, so even if it makes literally no logical sense at all, this is something which to them was a matter of great importance. So, the Arab-Byzantine War broke out in 692, and it's pretty clear that the Arabs were the aggressors in this conflict. Justinian didn't really lose a ton of territory during this war, but he did suffer some humiliating battlefield defeats, and some of those came because a portion of the Sclavenians who he settled in in Asia Minor actually defected in battle and joined the Arabs. There was a general in charge of them called Leontius who was imprisoned for this, and we'll come back to him later since he becomes an important figure in Justinian's life for other reasons. One other thing that Justinian did during his first reign is he engaged in an ambitious building project. Now, there are no surviving examples of Justinian II's buildings, probably because they either weren't finished or because his successors took credit for them. But anyway, that's an obvious instance of him really trying to imitate Justinian I, who is best known as a builder in addition to being a conqueror. But the real lasting legacy of, say, Justinian I is the Hagia Sophia. Justinian II tried and failed to copy that, and a lot of it is because he presided over an empire which, as we noted earlier, is significantly less wealthy than the Byzantine Empire of the 6th century. Ever since Constantine the Great back in the 4th century, one of the major expectations that people had for emperors in the East is that they would preside over the church and ensure orthodoxy, as well as defend the faith. Now, Justinian II himself was always in accordance with the Orthodox faith, and as we'll see, he attempted to add to the teachings and practices of the church. Some of his predecessors were actually heretics, but Justinian II at no point could be considered a heretic, which no doubt helped him achieve saint status, even if that was short-lived. His famous religious contribution was called the Quinisext Council, which means the Fifth Sixth Council. This is actually a tribute to Justinian I and to his father Constantine IV, because each one of them presided over a council. The Fifth Council was the Council of Justinian, and the Sixth Council was the Council of Constantine IV. Both of those councils were about theology. However, Justinian II was content with the theological findings of his father. He was more interested in conduct. So what he was looking for was a reformation of morals that would affect both clergy and lay people, and he ended up passing 102 different canons on behavior. Now, this caused a ton of controversy, and it also caused a lot of disputes with the West. The problem with these canons is that because they were passed in the East, they reflect Eastern practices and standards. Remember, the East spoke Greek and had been able to maintain a higher standard of living for the most part, especially in Constantinople, than had been the case in the West. And because a lot of these priests and bishops were relatively independent, they could kind of develop their own local traditions. And there were obviously going to be some differences between a church which mostly spoke Greek and its other half which mostly spoke Latin. Certain differences would also emerge from local geography, and you can imagine how this would happen over the course of a couple centuries. Now, because a lot of Western practices are explicitly condemned as barbaric and kind of mocked, the Pope clearly took exception to this and was not happy. And even during his second reign, when Justinian was fortunate enough to have a pope of Syrian extraction in office, who was a lot more favorable to Eastern standards, this was something that was really a matter of controversy and something which was never quite successful. His main target for these canons was the what he saw as pagan survivals, so customs which harkened back to old Greek religious festivals, which might mention or seem to allude to gods like Dionysus or Artemis or Athena. Now, chances are a lot of these practices would be things which had kind of just become cultural and no longer had much of a religious significance. However, like many Byzantine emperors, Justinian II was an adamant, hardcore, no-nonsense Christian who was absolutely dedicated to eradicating anything out of keeping with what he saw as the one true faith. The problem for the people living in Constantinople, and later for Justinian, is that the things that he went after were things that they liked. A lot of popular activities, such as playing dice, dancing, and acting, came under fire and were forbidden for both clergy and laity alike. And we can only imagine that this must have made him deeply unpopular with the people, even if it apparently did endear him to the church. So later on, he clearly has popularity issues in the city, and this seems to be the most likely cause. He was the Quaker in their group. He's the guy who's trying to take all the fun away. So this may be something which cost him public popularity, and something which ultimately contributed to his downfall both the first and the second time. Aside from being the emperor with the slit nose who came back despite the social stigma he bore, Justinian II is probably best known for his coins. And the major innovation of his first reign, which he brought back during his second reign, is the introduction for the first time of Jesus on his coins, on the obverse or front. And then he portrayed himself holding a cross on the back, as you see here. These are the two sides of the same coin. Now, this image that he has of Christ with the long hair, this becomes sort of the standard image of Christ that we see a lot in Christian iconography and on future coins which feature Christ. Now, to circle back to that whole thing about the coinage and papyrus dispute that led to the 692 Arab-Byzantine War, I think Constance Head made a really good point when she said that the inclusion of Christ on these coins is probably what made the Caliph want to start minting coins rather than circulating Christian propaganda on coins. And this might also have been the reason why the Arabs started putting Islamic symbology on the papyrus that they exported to Constantinople, that maybe it was a religious propaganda war. That's certainly what it seems like, and I think that her argument there is pretty solid. So anyway, this is what Justinian did, and after him, we see that this image of Christ becomes standard. During his second reign, he actually tried a different look for Jesus, what is called the Syrian look, which has shorter hair, but that didn't catch on, and it was actually the design from his first reign which became standard. In 695, Justinian II was deposed and mutilated. And the question then becomes, why? What motive did people have for overthrowing him? Well, the primary motive seems to have been that Justinian II was a champion of small farmers over large landowners, that he pushed for their rights over the rights of large landowners to impose upon them or to rule like local aristocrats. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on the details of how that would have worked. I am an ancient historian, not a medieval historian or a Byzantinist, so I can't really say much more than that. However, we also know from some of the sources that Justinian II apparently had two very famous and deeply unpopular tax collectors who liked to employ harsh methods such as imprisonment and torture in order to ensure payments that were on time and in full. And the primary victims of these two taxmen were the rich, because they're the ones who had the money. Now, if we circle back to the Arab-Byzantine War of 692, the general in charge of the Sclavenians was this guy named Leontius, who was a landowning patrician. And for his failure, he was imprisoned for about 2 or 3 years. And then Justinian in 695 decided to set Leontius free with a pardon, and also he gave him a commission to take up a new army. Well, Leontius was still kind of pissed off, and he was approached by the other landowners, and they joined in league and overthrew Justinian, and Leontius declared himself to be emperor. Now, because Leontius was an old friend of Constantine IV, he decided to take the merciful course, the Christian course, and he chose to inflict rhinocopia on Justinian and then exile him. Now, rhinocopia is where a nose is slit. I'm not entirely clear on how the practice would have been employed, but in this illustration, it looks like his nostrils were basically trimmed back to the point where he was given a unattractive but not unserviceable nose. This seems to have been something which would have been disfiguring without necessarily, crippling or making a, really lowering a person's quality of life to a major degree. But the custom back then for the Byzantines was that an emperor could not bear any major physical faults. This is something which actually goes back to the Romans, and which almost prevented Claudius in the 1st century from holding power, the guy who had a bit of a limp and a drool. So this was seen as something which would effectively prevent Justinian from reclaiming power, and the idea is now he can go live out his days in exile. But as you already know, it didn't quite work out like that. After being mutilated and deposed, Justinian was sent to Cherson, which is a city in the southern Crimea, and he remained there for about 9 years, from 695 to 704. During his time there, he made friends with a local abbot, and this person was almost certainly responsible for reporting to the imperial government about Justinian's activities, and we can only imagine that he probably gave a fairly favorable portrayal of what Justinian was saying and doing, and most likely he downplayed all of Justinian's talk about coming back and getting revenge. Eventually word got out, though, about Justinian's intentions, and before imperial authorities could crack down, Justinian fled to the Khazars, and he promised an alliance if he were to be restored to power. And in pursuance of that strategy, he married a Khazar princess who was the sister of the current Khazar ruler, and he declared her the Empress Theodora. Now, later on, this Khazar ruler would get cold feet and decide that Justinian wasn't going to win, but Justinian did not give up, and he eventually kept building his supporter base and was determined to come back, despite the fact that no one really believed in him and that he had been betrayed by his brother-in-law. Let's take a look at what was going on back at Constantinople while Justinian II was occupied in the Crimea. So Leontius, the man who overthrew him and mutilated his nose, was only in power for 3 years, and he had the misfortune of presiding over the fall of Carthage in 697. Now, Leontius never really left Constantinople, but he did dispatch a big fleet to try to retake the city in 698, and that relief force failed miserably. Since they were dealing with an emperor who had once been a general, they figured that he wouldn't take kindly to incompetence, so they found a German guy named Apsimar, and they declared him emperor and decided to take the throne to avoid punishment. Now, Apsimar took the name Tiberius and overthrew Leontius, ironically inflicting rhinocopia upon him and making him a monk right there in Constantinople. And Tiberius reigned for about 7 or 8 years. I don't know. I'm not good at math. You do the math for yourself. I'm a historian, not a mathematician. 7 years. Now, Tiberius is kind of forgotten because he was a usurper and he never left any dynasty, but he actually had real foreign policy success. He won several major victories against the Arabs. However, as we already know, he was overthrown by the ex-emperor Justinian II. And now for the series of events which made Justinian II a true legend. So, we've already discussed all of the setbacks he had and the betrayal at the hand of the Khazars, but Justinian II was not deterred, and he was going to press on to victory or find his death somewhere on the battlefield. At one point, he's sailing around with his small band of compatriots trying to gather funds and allies, and a horrible storm blew up, and one of his sailors asked him to pray to God to save them in exchange for Justinian pardoning all of his enemies and not seeking vengeance. Justinian responded that if he so much as truly considered pardoning any of his enemies, that he wished that God would strike him down right then and there. And that is probably an apocryphal story spread by the people like Theophanes, who are trying to paint a dramatic portrait of this crazed lunatic. However, it does show the level of determination that Justinian had to succeed against virtually impossible odds. Now, when he got to Constantinople, the main allies he'd been able to find were the Bulgars north of the Danube under the ruler Tervel, who was really important for setting up the Bulgar state. Now, when he got there, because most of his army was foreign and because Tiberius was actually not hated, the citizens wouldn't open up the gates. Now, maybe if Justinian hadn't been so anti-fun, a few citizens might have been willing to bring him back. After all, people back then tended to be relatively loyal to dynasties such as the Heraclians, who had ruled for a long time and accomplished great things. But apparently Justinian II didn't have that aura. Or possibly the social custom of rhinocopia still held a kind of influence which prevented them from thinking that he was worthy of holding the throne anymore. Anyway, it became an academic issue, though, because Justinian and his men managed to locate a hidden gate, and he took his hardcore following in with the Bulgars outside, and he managed to take the palace, and he overthrew Tiberius. When he eventually captured Tiberius, who had fled, he brought Tiberius and Leontius to the hippodrome, and he used the two of them as footstools while the races went on. At the conclusion of the events, he had both men, who had the same nose problem that he did, executed in front of the public, while they chanted a psalm about disobeying your master and the punishment that you get. Now, during this time, Justinian had taken to wearing the golden nose to disguise his disfigurement, although just like Donald Trump's love of things golden, it doesn't really cover anything up, and it really just draws attention to your own shortcomings. But Justinian II thought that it was mega classy to have a golden nose. So what are you going to do? During this period, he went after all of the relatives and key supporters of both usurpers, and since these men had ruled for 10 years between them, this meant that a great number of senior generals were executed, and this will probably lead to a lot of the military failures that take place in Justinian's second reign. When Tiberius, his young infant son, and his wife Theodora arrived in 706, Justinian crowned Tiberius as his co-emperor, and that was to set up the line of succession, and apparently to, then give the Heraclian line a sixth generation. However, as we'll see, Tiberius never grew up and never got to rule anything. During his first reign, Justinian was pretty successful on the battlefield, but during his second reign, it was almost all defeat and disaster. In 708, he tried to repeat his Sclavenian campaign from his first reign by marching into the Balkans, but he was soundly defeated by the Bulgars in 708 and barely escaped with his life and freedom. Presumably, these were not the Bulgars of Tervel, since Tervel was still an ally 3 years later. but there were, as I said earlier, many different groups of Bulgars, and the Bulgars who defeated them were most likely the ones who had invaded the Balkans. Now, from 709 onward, he's also under constant attack from the Arabs in Asia Minor, and he loses some key outposts and cities, and these defeats really help undermine his credibility once again. The sources say that the effectiveness of his army was really held back by the number of inexperienced troops and commanders that were present. The inexperienced troops, we're not sure why there would be inexperienced troops as opposed to some other time. But as for commanders, we just talked about how during his quest for revenge, he killed many of the senior commanders of the empire, and that is going to come with a price, and the price is battlefield defeat. We do know that he mounted an expedition to Ravenna in order to punish these insubordinate nobles there. That expedition actually did work, and they brought back some disloyal subjects and had them executed in Constantinople. Now, later on, there was a revolt in the Crimea where one of the armies he had stationed up there revolted and went over to the Khazars. So he sent a second expedition to deal with the problem, and they failed. So by this point, Justinian II was known as a fairly merciless guy, and just like that expedition which Leontius had sent out to Carthage, they're thinking that they really don't want to go home and face the consequences of failure. In the sources, the whole Crimean campaign is said to have been motivated by Justinian's desire for revenge on either the people of Cherson who turned him out or the Khazars who betrayed him. But because he waited until so late in his second reign, and it had been, several years by that point, that doesn't really make sense. And Cherson also does have some real value as a place which is close to the grain supply, since Constantinople had, a larger population than its local, environment could sustain with grain. Anyway, that is Justinian's war and peace record in the second reign. While the sources portray Justinian as a madman who had no plans and was not really capable of rational thought, as Constance's head shows, there's plenty of evidence that he had a foreign policy, and that foreign policy was centered around trying to create strong foreign alliances which would keep Byzantium out of war. Now, we do know that his efforts with the Bulgars were successful, at least with Tervel and his Bulgars to the north of the Danube. Tervel not only supported Justinian in reclaiming power, but also remained a staunch ally and sent him reinforcements during a conflict in the year 711. Now, Justinian also made major overtures to the Umayyad Caliphate, including sending a lot of skilled craftsmen to Damascus to help build a major mosque. However, as we've already noted, from 709 onward, the Arabs were launching a full-scale offensive against Justinian and the Byzantine homeland of Asia Minor and making major progress, so obviously that effort failed. And in general, his diplomacy was mostly unsuccessful. One thing that he did pull off that I didn't list here is that he actually had the last official papal visit to the east, and at least to the east for an emperor of Byzantium, where he had the Pope from Syria visit, and they had a meeting, but that was shortly before he was overthrown, and it didn't really end up accomplishing much. Now, one example of the state of his officer corps is that there was a young man who later became the Emperor Leo III, and Justinian basically appointed him to power because Leo was someone who had been generous to Justinian on one of his campaigns that had turned south by giving him and his army a large number of sheep. Later on, Leo was accused of treason and plotting against Justinian, but Justinian, at the trial, realized that Leo wasn't guilty and he had him pardoned, and then appointed him ambassador. However, if you look at the track record of diplomacy under Justinian during the second reign, you see that Leo might not have been the best diplomat, since none of Justinian's agents seemed to get a lot of things done. Let's revisit the issue of Justinian II's support for small farmers over large landowners. Now, this seems to have been a policy which continued into his second regime from his first, and the most obvious motive that he might have had for such a thing would be the fear of decentralized power and the fear of local aristocrats becoming strong enough to break away and do their own thing. This whole policy of supporting small farmers was something which a lot of Byzantine emperors tried, and the difference, though, is that it seems like Justinian might have gone a little far with it, and that he alienated aristocrats in a way that other emperors didn't. At least Constantine's head seems to think that conditions in the empire in general were starting to shift to a point where small farmers were favored. But again, I'm not an expert on either agriculture or Byzantine agriculture, so I can't really say much else. One thing that I can say is that the favoring of small farmers over large landowners really came to its peak in the 10th century, especially under emperors like Basil II, the Bulgar Slayer, when the small farmer in Byzantium really had his heyday, and when the power of the landlords was at its lowest point. So how did Justinian II fall for the second time? Well, let's recap what had happened. The first expedition that Justinian had sent up north had defected to the Khazars, and that expedition had been headed by a general named Helios. The second expedition had gone up there and failed to defeat the first and the Khazar allies, and then it too had effectively defected since it realized that coming home would be suicidal. And the reason why the second expedition knew that it couldn't come home safely is because in the meantime Justinian II had executed the family of General Helios, the leader of the first expedition. Now, this was a brutal world full of brutal people, but the execution of someone's family for their actions was something that was not very common. So this is something which may have alienated people from Justinian, but more to the point made them fear him and fear having the report failure to him. So they thought it would be safer to start a revolt and try to take him out than to go home and await his mercy. This expedition appointed the Armenian-born Vardon as their leader, and he took the Greek name Philip. And he sailed in and captured Constantinople while Justinian was away, which made it very easy. Justinian was actually fighting off a revolt in Asia Minor, which he assumed had been funded by Vardon, but it actually was not, most likely. What happened is Justinian takes his army out of Asia Minor and he's trying to storm back to Constantinople, but an army under Helios comes out and they offer a general amnesty for anyone who leaves Justinian and comes back to Vardon. And almost all of Justinian's army is willing to do that. They realize that the emperor who holds Constantinople has a major advantage, and we have to presume that because of the record of defeat that Justinian had been amassing in recent years, that his prestige was very low. Not to mention what we already talked about, the fact that he's not very much fun. He's a guy who tried to ban everything that's cool. So eventually he and his hardcore followers, the guys who helped him out during his time at Cherson, who never abandoned him even when he was betrayed by the Khazars, these guys fought with him to the end and they died fighting. But Justinian was captured and he was executed by decapitation at the hands of Helios himself. And Justinian was refused Christian burial and had his corpse tossed into the sea in the year 715. Now, this is especially interesting considering that Justinian II was a die-hard Christian who was so dedicated that he actually put Christ on a coin for the first time in history. But yet he was refused Christian burial and thrown into the sea as someone who was seen by his opponents, at least, as almost an apostate. even though, as we talked about, the church did honor him for some time. Now, the fate of his son is kind of sad, just as with Helios's family. Young Tiberius, who was the co-emperor, was only about 6 years old and clearly hadn't done anything wrong. So his grandmother, Anastasia, had taken Tiberius to a church for sanctuary, and she begged the officials who came to arrest the young emperor for mercy. But they would have nothing of it, since they wanted to exterminate the line of Justinian II Rhinotmetus, and they removed the boy from the church and took him outside and cut him down where he stood, right in front of Anastasia. And that is what ended the Heraclean dynasty in the line of Justinian II. Let's wrap it up with a bit of discussion of Justinian's legacy and an assessment of him as an emperor. Now, one thing that he did that was long-lasting, and it's something that he accomplished relatively early on in his first reign, was that he set up a revenue-sharing scheme for Cyprus whereby the Byzantines and the Arabs would share the revenue from Cyprus, but neither side would occupy it. Surprisingly, this arrangement lasted for 2 or 3 centuries, and it was something which was considered acceptable to both parties and also to the Cypriots themselves. So it was considered a win-win-win, and it's one of the wisest policies of this period, and one of the most long-lasting. Because of Justinian II's success at coming back from having his nose slit, future emperors who were deposed would be blinded. Because if you're blinded, you certainly can't reign, and that's something that no one ever overcame. So in that sense, Justinian was a pioneer, but not one who helped his future successors. The Heraclean theme system is something that Justinian maintained, and he may have improved upon it in some ways. He may have extended the extent of some of them in his early victories. So in that sense, he is partly responsible for the system, which eventually would help people like Basil the Bulgar Slayer to field large armies. There's also a big difference in his first and second reigns. All of the important things that he did were in his first reign, such as the Cyprus revenue sharing scheme and his military victories, whereas he's actually known for coming back out of exile and for the acts of cruelty committed in his second reign. So his legacy comes from the second reign in terms of what people know him for, but in terms of why he actually matters, all of that stuff is from the first time he was in power. Let's look at some possible interpretations. Sort of the most popular version is that he was a raving psychopath, just this raving loon, an out-of-control, revenge-hungry maniac who cared nothing for governance and only cared for smiting his enemies. I think that Constance Head has done a pretty good job of refuting that view, and I think that even if you look at his second reign, it's pretty clear that that's an unfair assessment, and that he did a lot of important things, and that he was at least trying his best in the second term, even if he didn't do what he set out to accomplish. There's also the view that he was irresponsible and unpopular, the view that maybe he wasn't crazy, but that he just wasn't all that responsible of a ruler, and that he failed to connect with people. The thing is, I think he probably was unpopular, but you gotta remember he was only unpopular with the people of the city and at various times with his armies. He also had a very strong relationship with the church because he was a Puritan. So he wasn't unpopular with everyone, and he was also very popular in Thessalonica, so we have to be a little careful about making broad generalizations. The view of Constance Head is that he was a conscientious but flawed ruler. He tried his best, and he made well-intentioned efforts to improve his empire and to advance the interest of the state, but ultimately his character flaws held him back. His hot temper, his impetuousness, his unforgivingness, these things really held him back, and these qualities were exacerbated by the rhinocopia, which made him a bit vengeful and hateful. My view is that Constance Head is basically right, but I also think we need to examine the scenario that he was playing in. he was operating in a world where it was difficult for a Byzantine ruler to succeed. And he came to power at the age of 16, which, even though it was the age of manhood back then, he still would have been a little better off had he had more time to gain some experience before taking power. And I think that there is an argument to be made that he had an inadequate skill set. If you look at the successes he had during the first reign, when there were still a lot of veteran administrators, tax collectors, and generals around, you see that he's able to accomplish things. He's got all this energy and he's got ambition, but he also has people who can help him execute. During his second reign, after he executed all those people who had served him, then served his usurpers, he had no capable officers around, and he's, promoting people like Leo III who are grossly unqualified for what they're doing. And then he's not winning any battles. And he doesn't seem to be making very many successful negotiations. I think that this shows that he was very dependent on his servants, maybe to an extent that a truly great ruler wouldn't be. Anyway, I think that Justinian II is a fascinating guy. I think that most of what people think about him is wrong. I don't think he was either a badass or a psychopath. I mean, what kind of badass tries to ban dancing, dice playing, and acting? That doesn't really accord with my vision of a badass. Anyway, I'm sure the conversation could go on, but I'm going to wrap it up. I'm Thersites the historian, and I will be back with you again soon to talk about other topics of historical import.